Nous sommes le Subcommittee des droits internationaux de la personne du Comité permanent des affaires étrangères et du développement international. Aujourd'hui, le 17 mai 2012, est notre séance 39. And once again, we are returning to the topic of the use of sexual violence against women as a weapon of war in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We are, I remind our committee members and our witnesses as well, we're televised today. So don't do or say anything you wouldn't want your mom to see, because she might be watching. Our guest today is Kristen Kalla, who is the Senior Program Officer, Trust Fund for Victims of the International Criminal Court. Ms. Kalla, we invite you to begin your testimony. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank the subcommittee for this opportunity to address you on the issue of sexual violence against women in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It is also a personal honor to appear here today because of my mother's family roots in Ottawa, going back in the early 1800s when my ancestors arrived from Wales and Ireland. So it's very nice to be here. My name is Kristen Kalla, and I am the Deputy of the Trust Fund for Victims and also the Senior Program Officer at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. As an international public health anthropologist specializing in women's reproductive health, I've spent the majority of the last 25 years living and working in communities who have experienced serious and chronic violence, conflict, and human rights abuses in Africa, the Middle East, the Balkans, and Central Asia. And I have seen firsthand that the horrific human costs of war and violence devastate people, societies, and the structures that support them. It has been 55 years since the United Nations first recognized the devastating effect of the most serious crimes on humanity, such as genocide. Since then, the Rome Statute has pushed the borders of international justice for the first time, giving a significant role to the victims themselves within an international instrument, combining a tribunal, the International Criminal Court, with a reparatory mechanism, the Trust Fund for Victims, responsible for providing court-ordered reparations and rehabilitation assistance to victims under the jurisdiction of the ICC. In relation to its first role, the court may order money and other property collected through fines or forfeiture from a convicted person to be transferred to the trust fund for the implementation of reparations awards. However, the fund can also complement such awards through voluntary contributions from states and other donors. Our Board of Directors may determine the extent to which the Trust Fund will complement court-ordered reparations in accordance with Regulation 56 of the Regulations of the Trust Fund. The Trust Fund's general assistance for victims is supported by voluntary contributions. It is implemented before the conclusion of the ICC trial and is not limited to the victims participating in the proceedings before the court. Rehabilitation assistance may be initiated once the Board of Directors has notified the pretrial chamber of the necessity to provide assistance to victims and where this does not affect the fairness of the trial as stipulated in Regulation 50 of the Regulations of the Trust Fund. The assistance mandate serves as a very immediate response to the urgent needs of victim survivors and their families who have suffered from the worst crimes in international law. Through its extensive work in the situations where ICC cases are being prosecuted, the Trust Fund has created a presence on the ground which can serve to inform the court of victims' needs and the operational realities in the relevant situations, as well as provide a mechanism to deliver reparations. The Trust Fund for Victims is learning valuable lessons about the unique role that an international criminal court can play in addressing the rights and needs of victims of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Through regular monitoring, evaluation, and targeted research, the Trust Fund is documenting and sharing these lessons to inform its work. But international criminal law is not victim-oriented, and those who expect redress through international judicial settlements have consistently been cautioned against over-optimism regarding the results. Even as victims' issues begin to take a more central stage within international human rights and humanitarian law, the remedies available to victims has been inadequate and inconsistent. And although women have been known to play a crucial role during and in the follow-up of violence by searching for victims or their remains, demanding justice, and trying to sustain and reconstitute families and communities, most justice and reparations programs have not been designed with an explicit gender dimension in mind, and there is little theoretical reflection as to what doing so would require. Situations formally open at the ICC include the conflicts in northern Uganda, Darfur, Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Kenya's post-election violence, Libya, and now the Ivory Coast. Today, I will only speak about one situation where the Trust Fund has been operational since 2007, and that is the DRC. The eastern provinces of the DRC remain in a state of conflict and insecurity. United Nations reports indicate that 5 million civilians have died as a result of the conflict since the 1990s. In November 2003, the Congolese government requested the assistance of the ICC to investigate and prosecute the worst perpetrators. And in March 2004, the first cases were referred to the court, and trials are currently underway, with a first conviction handed down in the Lubanga case just a few months ago. Multiple reports of mass murder, summary executions, patterns of rape, torture, forced displacement, and the illegal use of child soldiers has been documented in the DRC. It is estimated that at the height of the DRC's 6-year war, more than 33,000 children were fighting with armed groups, and close to 30% of the children abducted were girls. Since 1996, sexual violence has been used to intimidate, humiliate, and torture hundreds of thousands of women and girls in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Sexual violence against women and girls has been found to be the most common form of violence and the most widespread form of criminality. Rape has become a weapon of war used to punish communities for their political loyalties or as a form of ethnic cleansing. The United Nations Population Fund has reported that 16,000 new instances of sexual violence were recorded across the nation in just a one-year period. There were close to 5,000 new cases in northern Kivu alone. The UN also reported that over 65% of rape victims during that time were children. The majority of this percentage was adolescent girls, and roughly 10% of child victims are said to be under the age of 10 years old. Because the majority of rapes are not reported due to victims' shame and fear of social repercussions, these statistics should be taken as the bare minimum. Sexual enslavement and other forms of sexual and gender-based violence have also been perpetrated widely against girl and boy child soldiers in the DRC. We must admit that our collective response to this type of violence has been inadequate, and our failure to respond as an international community is magnified over time because of the effects of sexual violence linger long after the violent act, undermining and threatening the potential for peace, reconciliation, and security. Often the international community provides support for security, stability, and reconstruction, but forgets the short and long-term impact of sexual violence used as a tactic of war. The long-term consequences of sexual violence are many, not only medical, but also psychological and socioeconomic. The medical repercussions vary and include severed and broken limbs, burned flesh, rectovaginal fistula, sexually transmitted infections, pregnancy, and urinary incontinence to death. Adequate medical care for these injuries is very hard to come by in the DRC, and many survivors remain ill or disfigured for the rest of their lives. These are all the more severe the younger the victim is. Young girls who are not fully developed are more likely to suffer from obstructed birth, which can lead to fistula or even death. There are also many psychological and social consequences to being the victim of sexual violence. Victims often suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and suicide. This can be particularly severe in cases in which men have been forced at gunpoint to sexually assault their daughters, sisters, or mothers, and often with foreign objects. The most common social consequence for victims of sexual violence in the DRC is isolation from their families and communities. Raped women are seen as impure, frequently leading to their being abandoned by their husbands or having trouble marrying. The most extreme versions of this stigmatization can lead to honor killings, in which the victim of sexual violence is murdered by her family or community due to the belief that she has brought them shame and dishonor. Young women and girls who are cast outside of their homes or leave due to shame will most likely become even more vulnerable to further abuse. The psychological impact of this type of violence, added to forced conscription and enlistment, only conflates the injuries of former child soldiers in the DRC. Girl child soldiers, victims of sexual violence, face specific consequences from their time in armed forces or armed groups. The social stigma facing these girls is fundamentally different in kind. It lasts much longer, is more difficult to reduce, and is more severe, especially if children are born out of this experience. A report submitted to the Trust Fund from a psychoanalyst supporting one of our assistance projects in the DRC highlighted the intellectual and emotional trauma presented by girl child soldiers who were young mothers. Psychologists point out that the psychological effects of conflict on girls differs from boys. In addition to being generally stigmatized and marginalized as rebels like boys, abducted girls have typically been victims of sexual violence, as a result of which they also suffer from shock, shame, low self-esteem, and further rejection from their communities and families if they return. In 2010, the Trust Fund for Victims initiated a study with approximately 2,600 victim survivors throughout northern Uganda and the DRC, so we could better understand the impact of the violence and assess attitudes toward rehabilitation, reconciliation, justice, and reparations. Interestingly, our results clearly showed a gender dimension related to the impact of violence. Violence, that is, impacts men and boys differently than it impacts women and girls. And our findings suggest that among the Trust Fund's beneficiaries, female victims have experienced more severe psychological and social consequences. This, in turn, showed that women approach the issues of justice, rehabilitation, reparation, and reconciliation differently than men in the DRC. For all questions except one, women reported experiencing more severe psychological symptoms and more negative relations vis-à-vis their families and communities. Women and girls were twice as likely to report that their family was not at all caring. Twice as many women as men reported feeling sad a lot of the time, and just under twice as many reported feeling lonely a lot of the time. A third of women and girls said they felt distant or cut off from others a lot of the time, compared to only a fifth of men and boys. Overall, 10% of female respondents said they did not trust their community at all. And just as many said they did not feel important in their community at all. The girl child soldiers who were raped and interviewed in the Trust Fund survey also expressed it themselves. 68% of them declared that they are poorly treated by their communities of origin all of the time, compared to only 26% of male child soldiers interviewed. In cases where the abducted girls gave birth as a result of rape, they not only suffer from marginalization in the community, but they are faced with their own daily torment, torn between the motherly love for their child and the memory of the rape the child represents. Therefore, we must also ensure that children born out of this act of violence are accepted in the community and provided with the basic rights and needs that should be afforded to all children. Our results suggested that both the very real and urgent needs that victim survivors live with day to day in resource-poor settings, together with the violence that they have experienced during conflict, influence opinions about justice, reconciliation, reparation, and accountability. When asked if they feel they have received justice, over 70% of child mothers who were raped in the DRC said no, versus 21% of former male child soldiers and 17% of children made vulnerable by war. Under the Rome Statute, rape and other forms of sexual violence can constitute war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Charges of gender-based crimes have been brought in 7 of the 13 cases currently before the ICC. And there are charges of gender-based crimes in the Katanga and Njolo case in the DRC situation. The Trust Fund considers its assistance to victims of sexual and gender-based violence a key step toward ending impunity for perpetrators, establishing durable peace and reconciliation in conflict settings, and successfully implementing United Nations Security Council Resolutions 1325, 1820, 1880, and 1889. To do so, the Trust Fund has adopted 3 strategies. First, mainstreaming a gender perspective across all programming. Secondly, specifically targeting crimes of rape, enslavement, forced pregnancy, and other forms of sexual and gender-based violence. And finally, promoting women and girls' empowerment, a fundamental requirement of any rehabilitation, reconciliation, and peace-building process. Currently, the Trust Fund supports 34 projects that reach an estimated 82,000 victim survivors and their families in both northern Uganda and the DRC. Of these beneficiaries, over 5,000 survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, including 200 girls abducted or conscripted and sexually enslaved by armed groups, and 780 children of women victimized by campaigns of mass rape and displacement in eastern Congo are supported. The Trust Fund supports local and international partners like Oxfam Quebec to provide physical and psychological rehabilitation and material support, and these are legally defined categories that in practice can mean many things. Physical rehabilitation may include reconstructive surgery, general surgery, bullet and bomb fragment removal, prosthetic and orthopedic devices, referrals to health services like fistula repair and HIV screening, treatment, care, and support. Psychological rehabilitation may include both individual and group-based trauma counseling, music, dance, and drama groups to promote social cohesion and healing, and community sensitization around the rights of victims and to promote reconciliation. Material support may include access to safe shelter, vocational training, reintegration programs for former child soldiers, support for village savings and loans, education grants, and classes in accelerated literacy. The Trust Fund has several projects involving war-affected women and girls as key stakeholders. One of these projects in particular captures both the scale of sexual violence experienced in the DRC and the potential for the hope that these women and girls receiving support embody. For example, the Trust Fund has been supporting one of our international partners in Ituri province in eastern Congo to run an accelerated learning program and daycare center for girls who gave birth while in captivity. Many of the girls face stigmatization by their communities because of their past as child soldiers and the sexual violence that they have experienced. For these young women, their babies can be an additional source of social stigma, an impediment to their education, and a constant economic burden. Their own parents also reject many of these abducted girls when they return with their children. Rehabilitation efforts have focused on sensitizing parents of the former girl child soldiers to their responsibilities so that they can become involved in the education and rehabilitation of their daughters and grandchildren, thus reconciling the bond between these girls, their children, and their families. The Trust Fund has, for example, supported parent committees and encourage efforts of these committees aimed at income generation activities in order to generate the money needed to pay for school fees. This long-term effort is accompanied by psychological support, outreach, and peer education. The Trust Fund-supported school, in turn, gives these girls a chance to regain the education they lost while in captivity and develop a positive bond with their children. Now in the 4th year, the project continues to see substantial impact on several fronts. Perhaps the most immediate and powerful impact is on the strength of the mother and child bond. As they tend to their babies in the center's daycare, the young mothers learn that they are not alone and that their babies can in fact be a source of pride. Only several months into the school year, most girls begin to carry their children in public while wearing their school uniforms, a very public statement that being a student and a mother is not a source of shame. Rather, it is a sign of remarkable achievement. In South Kivu, the Trust Fund is supporting Action for Living Together, or ALT, a local organization active in Bukavu since 1999. ALT works with Bukavu's Panzi General Hospital, where it runs the Dorcas Transitional House for Victims of Sexual Violence who are unable to return home after their treatment. Panzi General Hospital treats at least 10 victims of sexual assault daily, averaging 3,600 cases per year. An estimated 16,000 victims of rape, some suffering from obstetric fistula, have been treated at the hospital since 2000. Survivors are often able to stay at the transitional house for as long as they need and are provided classes in reading, writing, and handicraft production. Many Trust Fund partners supporting victims of sexual violence have caseworkers, social workers, and counselors on staff to work with victim survivors. One partner in North Kivu, for example, employs an in-house psychologist to help build local capacity to respond to trauma associated with sexual and gender-based violence. This includes training in therapy, interview techniques, and more. As part of her assistance, the trainer works directly with some of the most traumatized of the 550 survivors receiving support from this Trust Fund project. One woman who was raped by a demobilized soldier in North Kivu could not speak at first when the counselor sat with her to hear her story. She could only communicate with gestures. According to the counselor, she would lock herself in the bedroom and cry every day, disgusted by life. At first, she refused treatment, but eventually opened up, speaking first to the counselor about her trauma, and then to the group of women the counselor regularly brought together to share their stories. Before treatment, she told them her heart would beat uncontrollably fast. She was consumed by panic attacks. Now, through the trauma counseling, she says her heart is healing. In her latest group session, she shared that she had come to forgive the man who raped her, and with the worst of the depression and stress behind her, is now focusing on building the tailoring business she has established with the help of the Trust Fund. It is important for the international community and national authorities in countries like the DRC to support the development and strengthening of judicial mechanisms designed to offer remedies and reparations for victims of sexual and gender-based violence. And although it is impossible to fully undo the harm caused by these most serious crimes, it is possible to help victim survivors of sexual violence recover their dignity, rebuild their families and communities, and regain their place as full members of their societies. The Trust Fund for Victims at the International Criminal Court has seen this firsthand through our Rehabilitation Assistance Program in the DRC. Protecting current and future generations from suffering the destructive trauma and costs of war require that the international community work together to prevent the start and spread of violent conflict. Alleviating the root causes of conflict and providing the impetus for nonviolent resolutions of disputes involving women will help create a more peaceful world. The costs of prevention are minuscule when compared with the costs of deadly conflict. The Trust Fund remains encouraged by our brave local partners, many of which are grassroots women, who work tirelessly to support and empower survivors of sexual violence. We are also grateful to governments such as Canada who prioritize assistance to survivors of sexual violence through your bilateral programs in the DRC. The Trust Fund at the International Criminal Court relies on the generous donations of states parties and others to fulfill its rehabilitation assistance and reparations mandates. And although we have never benefited from voluntary contributions from Canada, we certainly hope that our engagement with you here today is the first step toward collaborating on behalf of victim survivors of sexual violence and gender-based violence in situations under the jurisdiction of the ICC. Thank you, and I am available to respond to your questions.
Thank you very much. That was a very thorough presentation. Just looking at the clock, we can do 5-minute rounds. I think as a practical matter, they'll take us a little bit past our 2 o'clock wrap-up time, but we'll give that time anyway for each round. And what I'll just ask members to do is, if you have to leave early, just speak to other members of your party and arrange for yourself to go early and them to go later, because I think we'll find that these to be very thorough, worthwhile question and answer sessions. We begin, assuming we aren't changing things, with Mr. Sweet.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I go back to your opening comments, Ms. Kalla, that you spent 25 years working in areas where there's been serious and chronic violence and conflict with human rights, et cetera. So I not only thank you for being here with your testimony, but also thank you for enduring what some of us would shrink back from having to witness on a day-to-day basis. So how would you characterize now the relationship between the ICC and the Congolese government?
Thank you for your question and for your very kind comment. It's a little bit hard to tell, given that there is a new government in place, and in fact just a week ago a new Minister of Justice has been appointed in the DRC. So we are still waiting to see. Certainly the prosecutor and the registrar are the parties that interact much more with the government of the DRC than the trust fund. I would say from our side we interact quite closely at the provincial level, and also link up with the demobilization program for former child soldiers and receive quite a lot of referrals from the government's program for the former child soldiers to incorporate them as part of our rehabilitation assistance. We're really sort of in a transitional moment right now with the DRC government, so it's hard to comment beyond that.
Okay. Encouraging, though, at the moment, you'd say, as far as, you know, what you've seen so far? Hopeful?
I think hopeful, cautiously optimistic.
Okay, that's
Yes.
that's fine. You, on page 9 of your remarks, you mentioned about this growing strength of the mother-child bond, and even to the point where they were carrying their child with the school uniform, etc. Has that had any impact? I mean, you also spent much time telling us, and other witnesses have told us, about this real serious situation culturally, socially, that a woman deals with after, you know, they've gone through the terrible brutality of being raped and everything that means psychologically and physically, and then they're shunned by their own community. Has this aspect of the mother-child bonding and being more public, do you see any change in the cultural attitudes towards women who've been raped? Is there some hope there as well?
I think this is actually one of our finest projects, and although it is quite small in terms of the number of women and their children and families that are involved, we've been able to measure the impact, and as a social scientist we wanted to do this in terms of over time, longitudinally, where the young girls are accepting their children and their families are accepting these girls and their children back into the fold. And I think this is very unusual, and my experience working in development humanitarian efforts, especially in the health sector, has not necessarily focused in this way through the responses in their sexual violence programs. And I think this is a prime example of where we need to scale up this kind of response. And again, where perhaps other programs could modify their programs as well. So indeed, we are seeing, and very quickly, I think when you focus your response with the young mothers and their children together with their families, you see changes very quickly. And as I said, we saw them in the first 4 months. and where their parents were accepting them as well as feeling empowered that these girls could go back to school, and oftentimes were taking care of their grandchildren and accepting them back in the family. So, yes.
Great. You mentioned something that surprised me, that at least in the DRC, that 30% of the child soldier recruitment is female.
That's correct.
Of the over 30 projects that you're doing right now, I know that this is a huge undertaking to actually psychologically counsel someone who's been a child soldier and reintegrate them. Are you funding any programs for child soldiers to deal with that issue?
Yes, in fact, 30% of them are girls, but also girls have a variety of different roles when they're conscripted and enlisted. And oftentimes they're not necessarily going to combat, but they have roles as bushwives, they are sexually enslaved, they have other roles that they play. But indeed, it is around 30% in the context of DRC. I think one important thing to note is also the DDR program in the DRC, which is the demobilization program and reintegration program, did not necessarily have a gender perspective, and I think this program has been evaluated, and I think this is one of the weaknesses. Very few girls came through that program in DRC. And so oftentimes these girls did not benefit from the rehabilitation efforts in the same way that boys did. So this is where we saw a gap in that program, and this is where we decided to place quite a lot of emphasis in terms of our efforts. We have little funding, but where we are able to provide that support, we want to make a difference. And we have seen that by focusing on these girls, our support has gone very far in terms of their ability to recover, reintegrate, and also training them in terms of some livelihood support. We've incorporated village savings and loans, for example, with some of these young women, so that they can also work together and support each other. But again, I think more has to be done. This is a small effort, and I think other bilateral programs and multilateral programs should look at re-emphasizing perhaps some of their work to specifically target former girl child soldiers.
Thank you.
Monsieur Jacob, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank you, Ms. Calla, for your testimony on something that is very important. You dealt with the strengths and the weaknesses of the international mechanisms in existence now. I'd like to deal with this problem. There are a number of mechanisms at the international level to protect women against sexual violence during conflicts. I'd like to know what you consider to be the main strengths and weaknesses of these international mechanisms, including the Trust Fund for Victims, the International Criminal Court, various UN departments, and diplomatic initiatives.
Important question. I guess I would sort of argue saying there's really never enough. I think there are mechanisms, but where we see a gap is oftentimes there are global initiatives, and if you look at the grassroots level and what's really happening at country level, there is oftentimes a disconnect of what's happening from a policy level internationally, globally, from actual assistance and support reaching grassroots women in the most rural parts of Congo, for example. And I think this is where we need to work together as an international community to help connect our action and policy and political work with the actual needs of the women in the grassroots level. I think another challenge we have as an international community is coordination. I think we see it not only on this issue, but other issues. And how can we, in terms of our comparative advantages, coordinate in a more effective way? And where should we do that? Having meetings, for example, in The Hague is certainly important, but oftentimes the coordination needs to happen at the level of the country, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and also even in Eastern Congo. I know many meetings occur in Kinshasa, and we often attend these meetings. But Kinshasa, you might as well be in Brussels. What's happening in Eastern Congo is very far away from the capital. And again, how can we work together to coordinate and also involve grassroots efforts in our coordination efforts? And I think this is where we need to come together to strengthen our responses.
Okay. Merci. Et à votre avis...
Thank you. And in your opinion, what could Canada do in order to strengthen and improve these types of initiatives?
We are, certainly in the context of the Congo, we are encouraged by your bilateral program that has an emphasis on victims of sexual violence, and I would certainly advocate for you to continue to support that effort and scale up. We know, unfortunately, our primary international partner is a Canadian partner, as I mentioned, Oxfam Quebec, who just informed us a few weeks ago that they will need to transition out of our activities because of their lack of funding that they receive from the Canadian government, from CEDA, because of the reductions, which not only Canada but many countries are facing in terms of austerity measures. It's unfortunate because this will impact thousands of victims of sexual violence in the Kivus in eastern Congo. We will have to transition our Canadian partner, and again, we will have to look for other partners to work with us that can also leverage other support. So we would just encourage you to think about and review the kinds of reductions that you're making to your bilateral and multilateral programs. And we would also encourage you, obviously, from the Trust Fund, we would encourage a partnership with Canada. As I mentioned, we are not engaged in a direct partnership in terms of the Trust Fund, and we would certainly welcome that kind of support, earmarked also for sexual violence in terms of our activities in the Congo.
Okay, merci. Donc,
Thank you. My last question then. What are, in your opinion, the most efficient ways for Canada to bring about sexual equality and the importance of respecting women's rights in their relationship with the government in the Democratic Republic of the Congo?
Difficult one to answer. That's a really good question. I would say certainly it's important to keep an open dialogue. I think we need Canada to help to advocate with the government in DRC to be able to feel comfortable to talk about this issue. I know that in the context of Congo, they've been very hesitant to name what has been going on in Eastern Congo in terms of sexual violence. They've been very uncomfortable to make this a priority in terms of not only their national efforts, but also engage with other international efforts on this issue. And we would encourage Canada to keep an open dialogue, to help with advocacy at this level, and to build a partnership with the Congolese government so that they feel that there is international support to be able to address the issue together with its international partners.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Merci, Monsieur Jacob. Mr. Hebert, please.
Thank you. And thank you, Ms. Calla, for your excellent testimony. And I do want to commend you. Based on what you've said, you and your organization are doing fabulous work in very difficult circumstances, but bringing hope and a future to a lot of these victims. I guess one of the first questions that I have would be, do you believe or do you expect the Congolese government to be able to make some progress in holding the perpetrators of these crimes accountable? Or is this going to be, wiped under the carpet sort of thing and they just move on?
Well, as someone who works at the International Criminal Court, of course, in terms of our jurisdiction, that's a sort of different issue than helping to support national courts. And I think there are quite a lot of efforts from some of the bilateral programs to build capacity. And I think it's very important to build capacity of national justice and transitional justice initiatives. And I think, it's difficult to answer your question. We're hopeful that that will be the case. There are several other initiatives in the context of Congo, such as mobile courts in Eastern Congo that are being supported by other international groups. But I think more can be done, frankly. And obviously the ICC is a court of last resort. And it was the DRC that referred these cases to the court to carry out investigations. So obviously there were perhaps concern from the Congolese side that they didn't have the capacity to do so. So again, I think we are hoping that the international community will help to work with the Congolese government to help strengthen their capacity to investigate and prosecute these types of crimes. But at the same time, obviously, the ICC will continue in terms of its role related to these crimes as well.
In your testimony, you highlighted some of the work that you're doing to assist the mothers of who were the victims of sexual violence and transitioning them back into their families and into the communities, providing them with an education and so on. Do you know, has there been any studies done of the children that were born as a result of the sexual violence and what the outcomes for them have been?
There are several studies. We've conducted one. The University of California at Berkeley has conducted another one. I think the UN has several studies. But of course, it's difficult to interview minors and children. And the studies are secondary in the sense that you go in and you look at families and to see what's happened. Oftentimes, these children are more vulnerable than other children in the family. Because of the stigma associated with the rape, because oftentimes they're not accepted back in by the fathers or the husbands and by the parents, which means oftentimes these children are not able to go to school or receive this, or even nutritionally receive the same sort of food within a household. So this is why it's really important to have programs that address this specific vulnerability for these children. And again, why we're focusing on this and why we're trying to encourage others to do so as well.
Is there a difference between the reparations that are ordered by the International Criminal Court and the general assistance that your trust fund provides?
Yes, a very good question. A reparations order would obviously come after there's a conviction at the ICC. So what we have now is a first conviction on the Lubanga case. And primarily, a reparations award would be funded by the perpetrator, by the convicted party, through either fines or forfeitures, which could be liquidated and put through the trust fund for us to administer for reparations. Now, in the context of where you have someone who's convicted who is indigent, which is, it looks like the context of Lubanga in this case, the Board of Directors of the Trust Fund can decide to complement that court order using our voluntary contributions. Now, if that happens, our rules dictate the use of the voluntary contributions, which means that we can provide a collective order, not individual, which is very different than if the convicted party were to provide individual compensation for victims. So we're yet to see now how this will play out on the Lubanga case. We are in the middle right now of specific filings with chambers on this issue, and the court itself, the ICC, is in the process of establishing reparations principles. So for a victim, what we've learned from the survivors in these communities is that being identified with a specific conviction and court order has specific meaning for victims, which is different than the rehabilitation assistance that they are required to have that isn't necessarily linked to a conviction. So we don't require a conviction to be able to implement support for victims in their setting, in the situation, which is very different than victims participating on a case.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for, Mr. Hebert. Mr. Scarpaleggi, you're next.
Thank you. That was a fascinating, fascinating testimony, Ms. Kala, and some good questions, I might add, from the other members here. I've learned a lot from the questions and your answers to them. I'm trying to understand. I'm trying to understand organizationally, how this problem is being dealt with on a global scale. I mean, there's your fund, your programs, but then countries have bilateral programs. There's a constellation of NGOs. It must be hard. It must be difficult even for you to understand or know who is out there doing what, in the service of trying to help these victims of violence. Where do you fit in? Are you sort of the hub in the wheel? I'm just trying to better understand how the world is organizing itself to solve this problem.
Thank you for your question. There's no doubt in this type of effort, as I mentioned, it's always challenging to coordinate efforts. I would say that for the Trust Fund, before we initiate any of our activities, we carry out an assessment. And as part of that assessment in the situation, we meet with the government, we meet and in a variety of sectors where we think we will be operational. So obviously the health sector, education, gender, social affairs, and so on. That's very important. But we also meet with a lot of the bilateral programs and support in the embassies, as well as with the UN. There are, in the context of DRC, obviously in Kinshasa, there are committees that come together from the different sectors that involve the multilaterals and bilaterals and NGOs operating under those programs, together with the government ministries. So we will attend those meetings. And also there are meetings at the provincial level. So it's very important for not only us, but any organization, whether you're a donor or an NGO, to coordinate within those committees. And I think, you know, there will always be challenges around this, where you have many types of donors and partners, especially in a country that has a lot of initiatives. We're launching now in Central African Republic, for example, supporting victims of sexual and gender-based violence, and there are very few donors and very few partners working on this issue. And so our challenge is less about coordination and more about advocating to get parties involved in this type of effort. So each situation is a little bit different, but indeed, I mean, this is always a challenge.
So essentially, you follow your leads, and then you go into a local community. You look for all the interveners. You get together. You try and work out a joint approach in each particular community, and where every group maybe contributes something to the effort, and you make sure there's no overlap and so on and so forth. That's pretty much it, I guess.
Absolutely. You just described our work. Yeah. We do have staff that live in the situation. So again, it's very important to have staff there that can monitor the activities, bring the partners together, organize joint program initiatives, refer to each other so that our initiatives are linked to other initiatives in the community. And we carry out a mapping exercise that also involves other initiatives and the government. And it's very important to include especially the provincial authorities in this.
And so I imagine you yourself in your role, yes, you're on the ground, you're making sure that things are being pulled together on the ground, and then a lot of your work is, I would think, international advocacy and relationship building with governments to, as you mentioned, try and obtain voluntary contributions to your fund. And you've been dealing with the Canadian government over the years, or? Indeed.
We have met with your embassy in The Hague, and your ambassador is involved in what's called the Hague Working Group, which is the group that comes together of the states parties around the International Criminal Court. But this is the first time we've been invited to come to Ottawa, so we're very happy to be here. And as I mentioned, Canada has not been a contributor, and we hope that would change.
You're familiar, of course, with General Dallaire's work on child soldiers?
Yes.
Have you had
Sorry,
contact?
Mr. Scarpelleggi, you're actually out of time.
Sorry.
Sorry about that. The worst thing you can do is initiate a long and detailed, thoughtful response. That totally messes up our clock. So, anyway, Mr. McColman, you're next.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for as the Chair had said, your very thorough presentation today. In your presentation, I'm going to just refer to one section here. You said international criminal law is not victim-oriented, and those who expect redress through international judicial settlements have consistently been cautioned against over-optimism regarding the results. So I'm wondering if you could kind of paint a picture for us of what that means to you, having been on the ground as you have in this environment, and and have been involved in these really horrific situations.
Thank you. I think if we take the lessons learned from the other international criminal tribunals, for example, of Rwanda, I lived in Rwanda for 3 years just after the genocide, so it's one that I'm most familiar with, but also the Cambodia tribunals, the Yugoslavian tribunal, and now Sierra Leone. These tribunals did not have a mechanism to provide any support for victims during the judiciary process, and also at the end when there was a conviction. There wasn't an ability to do so. So although justice may have been served, I think victims in those situations never felt necessarily directly recognized, and they never received either rehabilitation assistance or reparations as part of those tribunals. I think this is the uniqueness of the Rome Statute when the drafters came together to learn from those lessons. And this will be the first time that you have an international criminal tribunal that has this type of mechanism. And I think this is why we have to measure the impact of it and how that is felt for victims. And this will be the first time that if the court orders reparations, for example, on the Lubanga case, that we will be able to assess what does that mean for victims. I think victims in the context of where we're working and what we've seen certainly in the DRC is, you know, with the mass atrocities that have occurred, what we don't know is how many of these victims will really be able to receive redress. And I think this is where, you know, meeting the expectations of victims in these communities and being realistic in terms of our ability to be able to fund either a reparations order or a convicted party to do so. You know, with the amount of funding we have, I mean, just to give you a reality, we only obligate about 3 million euros per year for all of these activities. It's really all we have to set aside to do so. So I think this probably speaks a little bit to your question in terms of victims' expectations.
Right, right. And the scope or the scale of it is hard to conceptualize.
Sure.
And you throughout your you know, your presentation, maybe I missed it. If I did, I apologize. But is there some kind of scope you could give us, the size of the number of victims, the scale of this?
In general or in terms of our support?
In terms of both in general and your support.
We are providing assistance to 82,000 victims, but this would be in both northern Uganda and the DRC, and that's every year, per year approximately. Of course, how you would define victims in the context of DRC, if you're looking specifically for victims of sexual violence, it's very difficult to have the figures. I mentioned that the UN has collected some information annually, but it's difficult to measure, and it's been, you know, anywhere between, I've seen 15,000 to 30,000 per year of victims of sexual violence, but it's very difficult to document given the circumstances.
Now, understand as well that the United Nations has a peacekeeping force in the eastern DRC. Are you able to comment in terms of their work in preventing this from happening and what the assistance they are providing to victims and survivors?
I'm not able to comment directly on their program. I know the UN has its own program to train peacekeepers. I know this because I was a trainer for peacekeepers in Ethiopia and Eritrea. So the peacekeepers themselves are trained on this issue in terms of also their own behavior, but how to address this issue with communities where they are working. I can't comment specifically. I haven't seen the program in Congo. Obviously, for the International Criminal Court, we interact quite a lot with the UN, and the MONUSCO provides us with support in terms of security and field operations. So we have a close collaboration with them in Eastern Congo.
Thank you.
Time, 5 minutes on the second. Madame Peclet, vous avez la parole.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd also like to thank, first of all, thank you for coming here and for all the work that you have been doing. It is quite extraordinary. And I think I can speak on behalf of all women in Africa. There's something I'd like to know. We've never heard from anyone who works at the International Court of Justice. Can you tell us whether under the Rome Statute victims are entitled to make a complaint, or is it the government that decides to undertake an investigation or an investigation by the International Court of Justice?
There are three ways a situation can be referred to the ICC. The first way is the state party itself can refer a case because they have their own concerns of their own capacity to be able to carry out investigations and also try. In the context of Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, those governments referred their cases to the ICC. The second way you can refer a situation is the Security Council can refer. And in the context of Darfur, of course, this was referred by the Security Council and Libya as well. The third way a case can be referred is that the prosecutor can decide to initiate the proprio motu powers of the prosecutor and decide there is cause to open up an investigation. In the context of the post-election violence in Kenya, this is what the prosecutor did, and then the judges will have to decide whether a situation should be formally opened or not. So these are the three ways only. Now, what's happened are dossiers have been forwarded to the prosecutor, and there have been dossiers forwarded, for example, against the Vatican for mass atrocities that have occurred in terms of sexual violence, and a dossier was submitted, I believe, a year and a half ago to the prosecutor. And also a dossier, the Palestinian Authority also submitted a dossier, for example, on the Gaza situation. And again, I think it's up to the prosecutor to review these dossiers and decide whether there is jurisdictional issues or not.
Donc, le rôle des États.
In other words, the role of the state is a significant one. Do you think that international pressure on the government of the Congo is strong enough to ensure that they will arrest of Taganda, for example, and that he will be sent before the International Criminal Court? Do you think that this pressure from the international community is significant enough, or is there more to be done?
It's always good to have pressure and partnerships with the government on these kinds of issues, and I think beyond that it would be difficult for me to comment on in terms of Bosco. Yeah.
On a beaucoup de témoins qui sont venus.
We've heard from a number of witnesses so far, and they said that one of the most serious problems in the Democratic Republic of the Congo is the accountability of perpetrators, a lack of accountability, and with the tribunals that advise the officers of the army or the police. And normally people were not brought before justice because the judge might have been a lower level. There were certain problems relating to accountability in the field. And can you explain to us what some of these problems might be?
I've heard this from victim survivors in Eastern Congo, concerns about the capacity of the Congolese justice judiciary processes, and I think again this speaks to what I was saying earlier about the need to strengthen capacity of the justice sector in Congo, and this is where I think it's very important for the international community to partner with the Congolese government, and let's hope that with this new government in office there will be an openness to do so.
Vous avez 30 secondes.
30 secondes? OK.
30 seconds. In your presentation, you emphasized the role being played by the community in reintegrating women. And we haven't heard much about this so far. That is, particular programs for combating stereotypes and the stigma of women who have been raped. Can you tell us whether in the funding that you receive it is necessary to have something for the psychological follow-up of victims and to social work in general, because this is something that affects the community at large and not simply the women who have been victimized?
And one that we find is quite challenging in the context of DRC. It's very difficult to find local capacity to be able to deliver specific trauma-based counseling in the way that especially these types of victims need. And so what we're finding is we're using our resources actually to help build local capacity to do so. And also deliver that type of counseling. But I think this is where we really need more support to be able to scale up this kind of initiative. In northern Uganda, we've been able to benefit more from a stronger infrastructure in terms of healthcare in Uganda, and so more capacity existed there. But in the context of Congo, this is very difficult. And also, where you have ongoing conflict, you know, in the context of northern Uganda, it's post-conflict. And time has passed, and we are really in reconstruction. In Congo, we're operating in a situation that is quite insecure with ongoing conflict. So even if we do build capacity, it's challenging for us to ensure that it's staying where it should be staying in terms of where these survivors live. So this is a big challenge for us.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sweet, we'll come back to you very briefly.
Just a quick, it just came from one of the answers that Ms. Calla gave. We also are substantial way through a study on Eritrea, and you had mentioned training UN peacekeepers in Eritrea, and I just wanted to check. They were expelled in 2005, so is that dated, or is there some new presence of UN peacekeepers there?
No, I was working for UNICEF in Ethiopia in 2000-2001, so this would have been the time we were training the peacekeepers.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you for your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I actually have a couple of questions myself I'd like to, if I could. The first one is it seems to me that although we've been studying the use of rape and sexual violence in conditions of conflict, or as we've put it, as a weapon of war, it sounds to me like there are actually two discrete things going on as part of the conflict there, which suggests possibly they have to be dealt with differently, although I don't know that. The first one is the use of women as sexual tools or sex slaves, and the purpose, I assume, is for the gratification of the troops. And the second is the violation of women on command, you mentioned by family members in many cases, in a sort of mockery of sexuality, with the purpose presumably of destroying not merely that woman standing in the community, but also destroying the family bonds and the man's status in the community as well. So the question I have really is, first of all, if you had to measure how much there is one problem out there versus the other, how many instances, I'd be interested in your response to that. And secondly, to what degree are the policy responses that are required the same or different?
I mean, certainly, you just described it very well in terms of the impact on women and girls. I would also add that men and boys are also impacted by sexual violence in the context of DRC in similar ways, but obviously the way it's carried out is a bit different in terms of the public humiliation, especially for the men in the community that happen to be raped en masse in front of their families and communities. I mean, we're working with both types and other forms of sexual violence and enslavement. We don't get in too much to taking testimony, for example, from survivors, and I think we're sensitive to that, obviously, because we're part of the International Criminal Court. And I think oftentimes survivors are a bit nervous of actually sharing their stories because they fear it might be used, for example, for the prosecutor's case, which is not the case for the trust fund. So we're just making sure that through our partners we are providing the necessary resources for whatever the harm suffered. I don't necessarily have an answer for you in terms of the policy ramifications. Again, I think it speaks more to the issue of the Congolese government ensuring that they have policies in place and national frameworks in place to be able to address sexual violence in general, and that they would feel more comfortable about talking about this issue in a variety of fora, and also providing the leadership to be able to support this kind of intervention. And we haven't seen that so much from the Congolese, and we're hoping that there will be change around that issue.
Thank you. The other question I had was actually suggested to me by our analyst, Melissa Radford. I just want to make sure I get this right. So, Melissa, please correct me if I misunderstand it. She's asked me to inquire whether you knew whether victims of sexual violence in the DRC are aware that crimes of sexual violence were not charged against Lubanga?
Well, I don't know how widely that's known in the situation. Obviously, quite a lot of civil society have been addressing this issue and have certainly filed also briefs on the issue. You know, the Women's Initiatives for Gender Justice, which is an international organization based in The Hague, represents thousands of grassroots women, and they actually filed on this specific issue. I think, you know, without talking about the prosecutorial strategy around the Lubanga case, we have submitted our filing just several weeks ago on the Lubanga case to say that perhaps the judges could think about broader definitions under a reparations order. If indeed we're using the Trust Fund for Victims resources to complement a court order, and it's a collective order in nature, you could perhaps include other types of harm suffered on the victims on this case to include sexual violence on a reparations order. So we'll have to see. It's pending, and we don't have a decision yet from Chambers, so we'll have to see how reparations is defined, but it's a very good question.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you to all our members, especially for agreeing to stay late. Our members have to rush off to the House of Commons because question period begins more or less right now. I thank Ms. Kala in particular coming this distance and making yourself available to us. This was very informative indeed. Thank you. You're adjourned.